Before we start up with Rabbi George, Leah is going to offer us a chant to help us transition from that discussion into the next one.
Sing upon joy, sing upon grief, sing upon the light of a new budding leaf. Sing upon joy, sing upon grief, sing upon the light of a new budding leaf. What is broke will be mended, what is hurt will be healed, what is lost will be found, hidden, revealed. What is broke will be mended, what is hurt will be healed, what is lost will be found, hidden, revealed. Sing upon joy, sing upon grief, sing upon the light of a new budding leaf.
Where do you learn all of these beautiful, simple, moving chants?
Singing circles. So there's all of these people. It's been a practice. It's of, we've always sung together, and there's this big movement that I've gotten to be a part of. All these song leaders, they refer to it as catching songs. And you'll see that there's a joke in Portlandia, like put a bird on it, like for like selling something, and it's like there's a song for that. Like whatever you have, there's a medicine in song. And sometimes you'll sing a song and you go, that's not the medicine, and then you'll sing a song and you go. So that's Lyndsey Scott. Lyndsey Scott. Sing upon joy.
So I would like to introduce Rabbi George. Rabbi George is Rabbi George. I'm so sorry how you're feeling today.
Yeah, I'm sorry to be laying down. I can't actually sit up right now.
So I'll introduce you. I'll do a short introduction, and we wish you much healing, and may your teaching accrue to your own healing and the healing of
Thank you.
Rabbi George. Everybody knows Rabbi George, and so
Yeah.
put in the chat. It's not Shavuot without Rabbi George. Rabbi George is the Rabbi Emeritus at Shomrei Torah in Santa Rosa, where he was the rabbi for 28 years, ordained from HUC, Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion. George is also a Senior Rabbinic Fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, and a graduate of the Rabbinic Leadership Program and Jewish Mindfulness Mediation Certification Program of the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. And he is an avid birder and naturalist. I always have to make sure that I say that word properly, so I don't give the wrong idea about what to do. And and Rabbi George is a great friend of Ner Shalom, and we love having you whenever you are available to teach or do anything with us. We're always so grateful. Good Yontif, Rabbi George. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Rabbi Irwin. I also want to shout out to you guys for doing this for a number of years. It's fantastic. Sorry, I'm in this state. What can I say? It's somewhat embarrassing, But here I am. I figured better this than off the camera. So I won't look at myself. So I'm happy to share tonight. I love the theme, by the way. I just think you guys, your creativity as a shul and as a rabbi and as a group, as a lifelong learning team is special and special to me. So I think it was Rabbi Irwin who said, "Hey, you want to talk about Maimonides and the controversy around his writing and his books being burned?" And of course, I had to say yes. So I'm going to teach you about Maimonides. He has a number of names. I'll go over the names and about the controversy. You know, the controversy in the book burning is important, but he's way more important than that. And of course, he survived that. He actually triumphed over the book burning. So a little bit about him. He has many names. His Hebrew name would be Rabbi or Rabbeinu Moshe ben Maimon. Our rabbi, Ben, the son of our rabbi named Moses, the son of Maimon. Maimonides is the Latinized kind of Greek Christian form that's used since the Middle Ages or a little after, when in philosophic Christian and Western writings. That's why we often say Maimonides, because we inherited that. He also has an Arabic name which would be known in the East. So in the Sephardic world, they might refer to him in his Arabic name, which is, sorry, my Arabic is non-existent. Let's see, it is Abu Imran Musa ibn Maimon, which is Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, you know, just same, but in Arabic. He's also known, let's see, Rambam. Rambam is the Hebrew acronym, our rabbi, Moses ben Maimon, and then Maimonides. I'm just going to go between Rambam and Maimonides for this guy. He was a great Jewish legal mind, perhaps the greatest that ever lived. He was a physician and healer. He was a philosopher, considered perhaps the greatest Jewish medieval philosopher. He was considered also a heretic by some and a hero by many. His ideas about God were so threatening that his books were burned for a short period of time. There was maybe 200 years of controversy, but by the 14th century, late 14th century, he was part of the canon, and thus he totally triumphed, you could say, from the controversy that followed his death. So here we go. Flames rise in the square of Montpellier in southern France. The year is 1232. Crowds gather, not to witness justice, but to watch books burn. The Guide for the Perplexed, that was his philosophic work. The Mishnah Torah, that was his great Jewish legal work. Halachic work. Works by one of the greatest minds in Jewish history consigned to ash. And not by crusaders, but by fellow Jews who saw in these books something too dangerous to preserve. Tonight we begin with fire, but we don't end there. We trace the life and legacy of Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, Maimonides, Rambam, a halakhist, philosopher, healer, and survivor of exile and controversy. As we do, we ask, what does his survival through this intellectual inferno teach us about our own age of division, censorship, and moral panic? By the way, this having many names is common amongst the great rabbis of the past. So for another time, we would have fun with the names. Tonight, okay, first, Maimonides, the man, who was he? He was born in 1138 in Cordoba, Muslim Spain, a golden age for Jewish-Muslim relations and the transmission of classical knowledge. Arab-speaking Jews, like Maimonides, were immersed, Arabic-speaking Jews, like Maimonides, were immersed in philosophy, science, medicine, and law, benefiting from the Islamic world's translation of Greek thought. So the Islamic world saved Greek thought from oblivion and translated it into Arabic. And that's where the Jews of the East learned. And then they, by the way, brought it to the West, and that's how the Enlightenment happened. There was a Muslim Enlightenment way before the Christian Enlightenment, and Maimonides was part of that golden age. Jews in Muslim Spain were second-class citizens, but they were protected by the dhimmi and considered people of the book, And even though they had a second-class status, they were allowed to share in the cultural renaissance that happened then, especially the elite upper class, which Maimonides was a part of. That golden age, though, didn't last long. It collapsed in 1148 for Rambam and his family. The Almohad invasion, forced to convert or flee. So there were various currents in the Islamic world, and there was a much more fundamentalist, zealous current. There was a number of them, but a particularly severe one called the Almohads invaded Spain and forced and ruled that Jews that lived there were no longer protected by the dhimmi and either had to convert, die, or flee or leave. So Maimonides, he was a kid, and his family wandered. They fled, and they fled to North Africa, which is strange because that's the heart of their empire. But they fled to North Africa and wandered for 18 years. They moved from city to city, from fear to uncertainty, until they finally settled in Fustat, Egypt, which is Old Cairo. There, he became not only a leading rabbi, but also the de facto head of the Jewish life in the region. Even before arriving, he had written a commentary on the Mishnah, which is the first level of the Talmud, and several smaller works. In Egypt, his true legacy began to unfold with the Mishnah Torah, which is his great legal work. I'll explain more about it. And later, the Guide for the Perplexed, his philosophic work. Yet, even in Egypt, his heart remained in exile from Jerusalem. He called himself the Sephardi from Jerusalem. So the person from Spain in this truly enlightened short period of the Golden Age, but originally from Jerusalem. So his heart was in exile from Jerusalem, from Andalusia, which was, that part of Spain where he lived in this Golden Age, and from his beloved younger brother, David ben Maimon, who died in a shipwreck in 1170. David had gone abroad to support the family so Rambam could continue his studies. And this was a tragedy. In fact, Maimonides was devastated by the loss of his brother, and 8 years later, he writes, and many of his letters, by the way, have been saved in various places, including the Cairo Geniza. That would be a great talk for another time, the Cairo Geniza, but I'm going to read from a letter that he wrote 8 years after his brother's death. He writes, "Close to 8 years have now elapsed, and I still mourn for him," that is his little brother, for there can be no consolation. What can possibly comfort me? He grew up on my knees. He was my brother, my pupil. He went abroad to trade that I might remain at home and continue my studies. My greatest joy was to see him. Now every joy has been dimmed. He has departed to his eternal life and left me confounded in a strange land. Whenever I come across his handwriting on one of his books, my heart turns within me and my grief reawakens. Wow. 8 years later, still in deep mourning for his little brother. David was the breadwinner in the family, as well as his beloved. So his death forced Rambam to seek income for the family as a doctor, eventually becoming the physician to the Sultan Saladin, his harem, and his advisors. This meant Rambam. By the way, there's also a Ramban, Rabbi Moses ben Nachman, who's a little doesn't overlap. He comes right after Maimonides and is a mystic. So you don't want to confuse the two. Although Ramban, it turns out, because he writes favorably about Rambam, kind of saved his reputation. But his brother's death not only crushed him, but it meant that Rambam, Maimonides, worked all day for the Sultan and almost all night healing the Jewish population, leaving very little time for his scholarship. So he writes about this in another letter. These letters are really something. He writes, I'm just giving you a small, he can be wordy in a beautiful way. So these are short forms. He writes, I reside at Fustat and the Sultan resides at Cairo. I would go to Cairo very early in the day and do not return until the afternoon. It's like 2 miles back and forth. Then I find the antechambers filled with people, Jews and Gentiles, nobles and commoners. I see patients until nightfall, lying down from sheer fatigue, scarcely able to speak. He also writes, I didn't bring it here, that it saddened him that it was very hard for the average person to see him as a physician because he was the rabbi, he was the physician, and to some degree the rabbi of the Egyptian elite. And I'm not talking the Jewish elite, although I'm sure it was true of them too, but the Muslim elite. Despite the crushing demands, he continued to write. Hold on, sorry, I'm embarrassed. Continued to write. And since our time is limited, we will just look at his two most famous works, the Mishnah Torah and the Guide to the Perplexed. Am I doing okay? You guys with me?
We're with you, although we're wincing a little bit looking at your pain.
Oh, the Torah is giving me new life. Don't wince.
Good, good.
I'm enjoying this.
Yes, so are we.
Okay, good. If you have questions, let me know. So the Mishnah Torah amounted to a radical reorganization of Jewish law, clear, accessible, complete, and controversial. And you got to ask the question, why? What's wrong with clear, accessible, and complete? So not Jewish, but no. To be serious, this is the picture you have to understand. So the Talmud is a 500-year conversation written down over the first 500 years of the Common Era, first in Hebrew, then in Aramaic, and it's not linear in any way. So if you want to find out about the laws of lighting a Hanukkah menorah, you actually find that in the tractate called Shabbat. That's how nonlinear it is. Because once they start talking about candles, they're like, oh, since we're talking about candles, let's talk about Hanukkah. And here's the story, by the way. So that meant that if you were a legal decisive, see, we think of Judaism as a religion. We go to shul, we do our own thing. We don't think of it as a body of law that governs our life. But for much of the Jewish world, for much of Judaism's existence, it wasn't just religion. It was life, and Jewish law, halakha, governed all of it. You needed answers, and you needed to go to someone for the answers. And that person needed to be able to give you the answer. So Maimonides lived in an age where he felt, it was time to organize Jewish law into basically into codes. So you could actually, someone that wasn't versed in the Talmud or didn't have time to go through the Talmudic discourse could look up the problem and find the answer. That seems like that would be a good thing, but it goes completely against the way Jewish law works, especially because when he did it, he omitted the sources and dissenting opinions. Talmud's one long argument. He took out the argument and he didn't say where the sources were. He presented his answer to the questions as halakha, as the law. And then he said, by the way, now that you have my book, there's no need to study the Talmud anymore. Not only did he do that, but he said he included Aristotelian philosophy and interwove it into the halakha, which probably was the thing that irked people the most. So why did he do this? He really believed he was saving Judaism from the end. He thought he was in exile. He thought Andalusia was the pinnacle of Jewish life. He didn't think there were many learned people around. He also had a very high self-esteem, shall we say, and he had, he didn't think much of the rabbis around him. And he was a zealot for what he believed was the correct understanding of Judaism. And he really felt like he was saving Judaism from oblivion. See, he lived in an age where Muslim thought and belief was at its pinnacle via Greek thought, and Jews that lived there were overwhelmed. And he felt like if he couldn't transform Judaism, there would be no more Judaism. In his own words, this is what he writes in his introduction to the Mishnah Torah. In our day, severe vicissitudes prevail, and all feel the pressure of hard times. The wisdom of our wise men has disappeared. The understanding of our prudent men is hidden. Hence, the commentaries of the Gaonim, the great ones before him, have in our times become hard to understand, so that only a few individuals properly comprehend them period. On these grounds, I, Moses, the son of Maimon, the Sephardi, bestirred myself to write. Okay, and then he goes on to make this statement. I've written this, he says, quote, so that a person will not need any other book at all with regard to any matter of Jewish law. It's a series of books, by the way, but still, once you have my code, you'll need any other book of Jewish law. For this book, he says, he writes, quote, will gather together the entire oral Torah, including the enactments, customs, and safeguards made from the time of Moses, our teacher, until the completion of the Talmud, as well as what the sages of the Talmud decreed concerning every matter, so that everything, will be organized and accessible to all, and one will not need another work besides it at all. That you have to know that for some, this was brilliance. For others, it was heresy in itself. And instantly, rabbis started writing commentaries to the book he said would be the last book you'd ever need to read. I think there are more commentaries to the Mishnah Torah than any other halachic work, in fact. Okay, so I don't know how much time I have left, but I feel the need to move to the guide.
You have plenty of time, actually.
Okay.
As long as you'd like.
So just stop there for a second. This guy, in other words, Rambam has chutzpah like no rabbi that's ever come before him and possibly ever after him. I mean, no one would say after their commentary, you don't need to study the primary sources anymore. That's just really an anathema to Jewish learning. That's what rabbis do, is study primary sources and argue over them. And we read commentaries, and in the traditional world, some are canonized, like actually Maimonides is part of the canon now. But this is, I mean, I think it's hard to understand, except he really believed that the people didn't have the wherewithal to do the proper Talmud study and rule correctly. And he really believed without the Aristotelian background, people were being led astray. And so he was a true zealot for his cause, and he just went for it. And his brilliance was such that he had enough respect. He was venerated in the East to such a degree. And at that time, the Sephardi Jewish community was a venerable community. Now we're so constructed on the idea that really Ashkenaz is Judaism, but then that wasn't quite yet true. So that in the East, Yemen, Morocco, or the Levant, that whole area, he was the rabbi, Harav. And so he succeeded in putting this Jewish legal work forward, and it was accepted more than less there. But in Ashkenaz, while they couldn't deny his brilliance, they also couldn't deny his arrogance. And they rejected his method. And yet it was so useful to them, and he was so brilliant, and even by their arguments, almost always right, that eventually they kind of gave in to him. But it took a while. And I'll come back to that. So any questions before I move to the Guide to the Perplexed, his other work I wanted to talk a little bit about? Wow. Okay, hopefully you're still awake. Okay, so the guide.
Still awake.
Good. So one
We're
last
here.
thing.
1%.
We're here.
Good. Let's move to the guide. I just want to say, like, if you were to study the Mishnah Torah, like, don't run out and buy it. Don't run out and buy either one of these books. They're both challenging in their own ways. The Mishnah Torah, if you wanted to delve into Jewish law, I mean, it's very useful, especially with commentaries. but it's a very dry, it's a legal code, basically. There's some interesting accessible passages like on Hanukkah, which would be fun to study if we ever wanted to come back to it. Okay, the guide is really challenging. So what language did he write in? He wrote the Mishnah Torah in beautiful Hebrew. When I was a rabbinical student in Israel my first year, we studied the Mishnah Torah because the Hebrew is so accessible. But he wrote the Guide to the Perplexed in Judeo-Arabic. Now, what is Judeo-Arabic? It is Arabic written in Hebrew characters with Hebrew loanwords. What does that sound like? It sounds like Yiddish. Guess what? There's Judeo-Arabic, there's Yiddish, there's Judeo-Greek. I think there were something like 22 languages at one time that were the language of the host culture, like Arabic or Greek or Ladino is another one, or Spanish, written in Hebrew characters. So he wrote in Judeo-Arabic. He wrote the Mishnah Torah in beautiful Hebrew, and he wrote the Guide to the Perplexed in Judeo-Arabic, probably because he didn't want everyone to access the guide the way he wanted the whole Jewish world to access the Mishnah Torah. He sent the Mishnah Torah, copies of it were written and sent out to the Jewish community so that they would have early access to it. He did not do that with the Guide to the Perplexed. Written in Judeo-Arabic and addressed to his student, Yosef ben Yehuda. The guide was aimed at an elite, those steeped in philosophy and Jewish learning, so Andalusians and the like. These people were torn by apparent contradictions between reason and Torah, right? This is what he writes in his introduction. This work is written for one who has been trained in philosophy and has had a thorough education in the teachings of our religion, who is troubled by the apparent contradictions between the teachings of reason and the literal meaning of the Torah. And then he goes on, do not read this work, nor communicate it to anyone, unless he be one who has qualities that make him fit for this discipline. And he says more about not sharing this. He didn't want this work to become public to the Jewish world, but come on, tell a kid not to do something and a kid's going to do it. Tell a Jew, don't share it, and then the whole board knows, and then the whole congregation knows. That was a joke. I don't know if anyone's laughing, but the guide centers on the use and limits of language, especially about God. And what he does is he goes through the Hebrew Bible, Tanakh, especially the Torah, but not just the Torah, and he shows that every anthropomorphic reference to God is a metaphor, allegory, or something other than a literal reference to God. I mean, painstakingly, God does not walk in the garden. God cannot get angry. God cannot have emotions. God cannot be anything in human form. He goes on to say that to describe God as having a body is idolatry. In fact, when you read the guide, you'll see that he thinks the prayer book in all its anthropomorphisms is idolatrous and narshkeit. He says it's for kids. That's the nicest thing he says about all the anthropomorphic references. God is male. God is anything that's limiting, which would be all language. The belief that God is corporal, he writes, is, quote, in my opinion, nothing but pure idolatry. Corporal, has a body. Quote, every attribute that the Torah ascribes to God is either metaphorical or refers to his actions, never to his essence. So he believes you can only say what God is not. Even then you have to be careful. You can't say what God is, because as soon as you describe God as good, you're limiting God in some way. What's really interesting is if you read his description of the limits of language, he's a forerunner like Wittgenstein and other modern linguist philosophers, theorists. You get the idea. Who like Maimonides says that basically language is approximate. We can talk about things because we have shared images. Like I say tree, you know what I mean because you have an image of a tree in your head. We have frameworks of meaning around words. But the problem with God is there's no framework. There's no framework. And so we use projections like nature or human or king because we don't have a framework for God. And he says that's a mistake, and an idolatrous one, a big mistake. And in the guide, he tries to prove this point. And you're actually convinced by the time you're done that he's right. He's so brilliant about it. It gets annoying after a while, though. Maimonides argues that the Torah speaks in two layers: necessary beliefs for the masses, simple stories with a personal God, for example, like God who enters history, the God of history that, part sees and talks to people. Those are simple stories for the masses that are necessary beliefs because he believes in law and order, seriously. So the people need their stories. You got to give them their stories. But true beliefs, they're for the elite, and they're philosophical truths hidden beneath the surface of the Torah text. So he's part of this esoteric tradition of reading Torah, where you have the Pardes, which is an acronym for the simple reading, the remes. So Pardes would be Peshat, more straightforward reading. Sound remes. You could say like a hidden meaning. Drash would be the duh sound, so like sermonizing stuff. And then Sod would be the true secret. And he's one of generations of rabbis that believed in the multi-layered meaning of Torah, Sheva Panim b'Torah, the 70 faces of Torah, and that, those who know, and what they know is that the garment is not the body. So he does it as a rationalist, but then a little later, the mystics do it as Kabbalists. It's the same impulse, though, just a different result. He questioned or redefined key doctrines, and this is where he really gets himself in trouble. So, for instance, creation ex nihilo, the idea that God creates from nothing, he actually says it's a draw. It's possible, but not provable. More problematic, the personal God of history. Divine providence as constant oversight. So, Chabad Hasidim, if they're true followers, or let me say, the theology is that God controls everything, including the leaf on the wind. And everything you do, everything that happens is controlled by God. He denies that. Reward and punishment, doesn't work that way. The natural course of the world unfolds, and you're a part of that. What befalls you because you're material, and you make either good or bad choices. But shit's going to happen. Now you can mitigate based on the choices you make and your wisdom, but it's not about reward and punishment. Although, there are consequences to behavior for sure, but not in the way that we're like puppets on a string. Also, prophecy and revelation. He really argues that prophecy. He believed that a perfected human being, and it seems he thought he was one, could attain prophecy through the use of their mind. He described it like flashes of lightning. When the mind is so clear and so attuned, the true nature of reality comes through, and that's prophecy. It's not God speaking to you. God doesn't speak. Very different. Maimonides was an elitist. Even among the Jewish elite, Rambam was controversial since his philosophical writings challenged the very core of traditional Judaism. The Maimonidean controversy burned brightest, though, in Ashkenaz, in the West. See, we think of, we have a sense that, the Muslim world backward, the Western world, more evolved, but in the 12th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th century, that the opposite was the case. 15th century, I don't know, how far you want to go, but the enlightened world was in the East, cosmopolitan, multicultural. I mean, we wouldn't want to go back and be second-class citizens there. And there still were persecutions of Jews, for sure, as Maimonides experienced. But of the two, it was better to live under Islam than Christendom. So Ashkenaz was the biggest problem. In truth, his beliefs and his legacy were in our complex. For example, he was a great halakhist, a great Jewish legal thinker and writer, perhaps the greatest that ever lived. So in that sense, he is the keeper of tradition, like as much as anyone who's ever lived. And that's part of why he survived the controversy, and a couple hundred years passed, and he's part of the canon. When I say canon, the sacred canon, and that happens to Judaism. Some of the medieval rabbis become part of the sacred canon, like Rashi, for example. So he was a great traditionalist. But in the guide, which, by the way, he wrote in a sort of code, which was not uncommon back then. So he purposely wrote it in an obscure way so that only those who knew would know and understand everything he had to say. I think for fear of his books being burned and him being attacked, which he occasionally was. I don't think physically attacked, although I think he was thrown in jail a couple times in his life. He wrote in code, and to this day, because of that, no one knows exactly how to interpret what he wrote. So you'll find contradictory statements that leave people wondering, and an ocean of ink has been spilled trying to discern exactly what he meant in the Guide to the Perplexed. There's like the skeptic version, there's the mystic version, there's a number of different possibilities. He was an uber rationalist who comes to what some argue is a mystical conclusion that silence, contemplation of the universe, is the ultimate form of prayer. So I have to tell a personal story if I have time for it. When I was just embarking on my Jewish journey as a young adult, I was a rock climber. I spent part of an early spring in Joshua Tree with a book written by Rabbi David Hartman, Alav Shalom, called The Living Covenant. And he was a Maimonides scholar, and I learned Maimonides from him, from Moshe Habertal, who's still alive, a great teacher, thinker. And I brought The Living Covenant and another work about Maimonides, and I'm in the desert, and I'm reading about Maimonides and this notion that the ultimate form of prayer is silence, which really spoke to me because I didn't know any Hebrew at the time, and prayer seemed just bizarre to me. So one night, full moon in the desert in Joshua Tree, I walked out in the desert to seek revelation. And I walked out like I just wanted it. And this is what happened. My mind was opened in a way it's never been opened before and ever since. For a while, I could see clearly in a way I never saw before. And I walked back to the camp where the other climbers I was with were. They're sitting around a campfire, probably a number of beers and other things on board. And they said, "What did you take? We want some." And I'm serious. They like, "Give me the drugs that you took." And I said, I have not taken any drugs. And I sat amongst them, heart wide open, communing with the universe and with them. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever experienced. And then what happened was I began to judge them. And as soon as I started to judge them, it shut down like a light switch. Boom, was gone. And even with, other enhancing substances and meditation and retreats and lots of silence, I've never in my life achieved that again. It was a true gift. And and an inspiration for me. Like part of why I went to rabbinical school later, I had a taste of this given to me thanks to Maimonides. I'm sure if he knew me, he would think, though, there's a real heretic. So I want to just conclude with the controversy, maybe a word or two about how he was rehabilitated. In Provence and Spain, Maimonides was revered. In northern France, he was feared. Eventually, a man named Solomon of Montpellier emerged as a chief opponent. He denounced Maimonides as a heretic, warning that his rationalism would lead Jews astray. In 1232, unable to win over Jewish courts, so first they tried the Jewish courts, Jews that has tried the Jewish courts. Maimonides' opponents turned to Christian authorities. This is also a theme in our history. And there in Montpellier, France, under pressure from Jewish denunciations, church officials burned copies of the Guide and the Mishnah Torah. A moment of shame, Jews invoking Christian power to silence other Jews. What can we learn? Well, the fear of ideas still burns. Book bans and curriculum purges in the US mirror the same anxieties. The complexity, doubt, difference, and dissent are too dangerous to permit. So, as much as things change, they stay the same. Another thing to think about is internal betrayal is the most damaging. When those within a tradition weaponize external power against their own, they burn more than books. They burn trust. And, we don't see this as much with books, but we see it, say, around Israel. If you're not considered pro-Israel, you could lose your job, you could lose your pulpit, we do this to our own, in our own way. The other thing we can learn is truth needs time. The ideas that provoke today may nourish tomorrow. Maimonides was once reviled by a few. Now he's revered by almost everyone. I mean, he wouldn't be fun to hang out with, that's for sure. But he's a great mind. I don't know if that's for sure. Maybe I'm wrong. He doesn't seem like he'd be fun to hang out with. And then I think we can learn that faith and reason can coexist. Maimonides did not diminish Judaism by engaging in reason. He enriched it. There's one last thing I wanted to say, if I can find it. The fire that burned his books did not destroy Rambam. His works live on, but the fear and fracture that led to those flames remain. Rambam's voice calls to us still, not from ash, but from endurance, and the constant tension between faith and reason, and fear and love. That's mainly what I wanted to say.
George, thank you. Really, that was it was beautiful. It was exciting. That was a lot of learning and equal parts spark and snark. It was like, oh, that was quite the roast of Rambam.
I'm glad. You
willing
inspire me, Irwin.
Are you willing to take a couple questions?
I am. I'm happy to.
I'm going to just start off and say that we started the evening today talking about sort of about consciousness at the core of everything, consciousness that from which the lived material world emerges, and then we also talked a bunch about non-duality. And I'm curious, with Maimonides, with Rambam's idea about negating all attributes. Every quality you can say about God is like, not that, not that, not that. So was he reaching for something like a non-dual view? Does he ever reach that? Does he have language for it? Does he have a sense of, does he ever say anything affirmative about what he's imagining?
You know, I have to be honest and say I do not know. I do not know, Irwin. Such a great question. And I've thought about it some, but I don't feel like I can, if any answer I give would be just too much conjecture. I do, it does feel that way. But I'm predisposed for a non-dual sense of things. So I feel like my bias would say, oh yeah, he was definitely a non-dualist. But he definitely distinguishes between humans. Okay, I'll take that back because now that I think about it, I mean, God in Aristotelian Maimonidean understanding is eternal and non-material, and human beings are. So we come in, anything that comes in and out of existence is going to suffer privations, he calls them. That's how it's translated. So things will happen to us. We'll degrade, we'll make mistakes, we'll fall apart. But God doesn't. So I would say no. Um, uh, but that's my best guess. Um, I think if to find the non-dual, you end up needing to go into the Kabbalistic Hasidic world where I think it is alive and well. And this is interesting how they actually. So what happens is, thanks to Nachmanides, at least one historical argument, who was a mystic and an Ashkenazi rabbinic figure, who criticized Maimonides' philosophic writings, but recognized the brilliance of his halakhic work and his mind in general. He became part of the rabbinic canon, and and what happened once you're part of the rabbinic canon, the rabbis that come after you can't degrade you and have to in some ways incorporate you into their own thinking, and they did that. So the great Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad Hasidism, quotes Rambam and makes a very rational guy into a non-dual Hasidic mystic. So, and then there's some that argue that he was that. So who knows? We need a scholar, not a student like me, to answer that question. That's a great question. I see some other hands.
Yeah, that was a beautiful, even without knowing for certain, that was a beautiful exploration and speculation. Thank you.
You're
Leah?
welcome. Lay, lay.
Oh, Leah, that's me. Thank you, Rabbi George. Thanks for showing up, even in bed. Maybe you should do more of this. My question may be roughly the same as what Irwin just asked, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I was also struck by the no, God doesn't do that, God can't do that, God can't do that. I don't know where I got the idea that God is kind of a word we use to mean all that is, source, everything, all life. If that's not a Jewish concept, because clearly to Rambam it wasn't, when did that come into play? Or had it been a concept before Rambam and then he walked away from it?
Well,
The
I'm not
idea that
sure. I'm not sure the thing is what Rambam would say is we can't really talk about God. In the end, he wouldn't say that. Um, and God is like the unmoved mover. So God starts the process of creation, and there would be no creation without God. But I think what he's arguing is to see God in the leaf and the wind, like the God saying the leaf needs to fall in this direction, this way, is a misunderstanding of how God works in the world. Once God starts the process is a natural process that unfolds. So,
so natural and God, so Mother Nature, the laws of nature are not part of God then.
the laws of nature are God manifest. And the way you actually commune with God would be actually to study the laws of nature. All the sciences would be a way to commune with God. The science of his time, but he would argue surely the sciences of our time. That's the ultimate way to know God is to know science, actually. Now, God is ground of all being is, you could argue from the very beginning, because what is Yud He Vav He, the name, God's personal name that we find in the Torah that we don't know how to pronounce, or that at least many of us believe we don't know how to pronounce. What is that? It's some form of the verb to be, the unfolding of reality. So I think, and then you'll find, you know, Jewish thinkers over time that describe God in that way. It's complicated, but yes, I think it is a definitely Jewish understanding. You know, there's so many Jewish understandings of God. It's hard to find one unless you're a polytheist. That's not a Jewish understanding.
Zelda?
Need to unmute Zelda. Uh-oh.
Hi, Robin here. If you have space.
Sure, we lost Zelda. Maybe
Not
Zelda will come back.
Hope I didn't do that. I
Uh,
went. Oh, I lowered her hand, but Zelda, you need to unmute, and Robin will take you after that. Okay, Zelda, you seem to be unmuted, but we're not hearing you. So maybe your microphone's not connected. Do you want to put a question in the chat and we can relay it? Yeah, I see that you're not muted, but we're not hearing you. Not hearing. Oh, maybe you just appeared. Zelda, say something? Okay, if you'd like to put something in the chat, that would be.
What happened at
So
Joshua?
she wants to know
She
what
just
happened
did.
in Joshua Tree. So I'm happy to tell that. I'll try again. So in Joshua Tree, I walked out into the desert after reading about Maimonides and his notion that one encounters God by contemplating the universe. And I walked out into the desert in the middle of the night on a full moon and sat on the desert floor, looking up at the stars, contemplating the universe. And forgive me for saying it this way, but God came to me, or opened my mind, or opened my eyes, or opened my heart. I'm mostly a rationalist, if you know me, but I've had these experiences, and I would call them acts of grace, chesed. And this is the one case where I actually asked for it, which isn't usually the case, and it happened. And it was a great gift. And for a while, my heart and mind and eyes were open to the universe in a way I can't really describe. There was really very little separating me from this great wide open. It was just profoundly beautiful. And when I wandered back into camp, because I was camping with a bunch of rock climbers, I was a rock climber then, they noticed and wanted to know what drugs I was taking. And I wasn't actually taking drugs. And for a while, I hung out with them. But as soon as I started to judge them, it shut down instantly. And that was the only time I experienced that in my life.
Beautiful.
Robin, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, it sounds to me like he is trying to describe the movement of energies that, from a human point of view, and not to mystify them, but to make them more accessible as energy as the human mind can contemplate it.
Could be. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what you mean.
I'm either.
He
I'm
he
working with it.
he really I mean, he was a rationalist, right? And so he writes in a very, even though the guide is really hard in some ways, some parts are really clear and other parts are hard to understand. He he writes like, you know, he learned logic also from Muslim culture, and he writes in a very logical way. And so, you know, he considered is like a scientist would write, maybe.
He sounds like the Einstein of his time.
Could be. He certainly was brilliant. And he learned obviously from brilliant people and from a society, by the way, that was enlightened for its age. So I think it's helpful for us in the age we live in now to think of the Arabic Islamic culture of its time of being enlightened. It just sheds a different light on a culture that we tend to, in some ways, disdain, which of course, we shouldn't.
Yeah, thank you.
Paige has a question.
Paige?
Hi there. Thank you very much for that very interesting lecture. I really find it interesting that he was considering these types of concepts at the time. And I could also understand why he would divide it into more public accessible knowledge and to more esoteric philosophic knowledge. But my question was more of a historical nature. I was just curious, when you say Ashkenaz, like as a regional thing, I'm just curious, was there like a sort of a connection regionally between all the different rabbis and scholars and thinkers and such, like to where there was a transmission of knowledge? Like when you say Ashkenaz, like what does that mean compared to where he was in exile in Egypt? I know there was a lot of shifting political landscape and such at that time, and it's very interesting to me. And
It's a really good question. It's really interesting. So we'd have to look on a map, but part of Spain, Ashkenaz would be, let's say France, France, Germany, and then, of course, Poland, Eastern Europe later. But what we consider a Western and Eastern Europe is a little complicated because like Sephardic Jews ended up, like what is Italy? Well, it's a Sephardic community, but also an Ashkenazi community. So the history gets a little complicated and depends on where people landed. But basically, maybe the way to understand it is Muhammad and his armies conquered much of the Middle East and part of Europe. That would be Sephardi, and that would be where Rambam was the rabbi, capital T, and his writing was accepted, and there was very little controversy around him. And then the Christian world would be Ashkenazi in terms of how they lived and their influences. So Jews living under Christendom didn't experience the enlightened world that Jews living under Islam did. Not that it was great being part of the Islamic rule, but it was better. But there was commerce and connection between the Jewish communities and Maimonides. But when he sent out his copies of the Mishnah Torah, I don't know how many he sent west. He sent mostly, I think, east. But of course, copies also ended up in the West. And there were rabbis that moved and people that moved from east to west. In fact, many believe that they were Jews who translated from Greek thought went from Arabic to Hebrew to the languages of the West. And there were rabbis that shared both places. In fact, so Maimonides' supporters were mostly from the East, but he had supporters also that were in Ashkenazic, and maybe Christendom is the better way, that lived under Christian rule, but read his work and admired it. But generally that was the divide. But there was definitely a relationship between the two. But really living under Christendom was so different from living under Islamic rule that the communities really developed in different ways. They shared the same halakha, Jewish law, for the most part, but there were regional differences and a lot of cultural differences. And over time, those got exacerbated. Does that help?
yeah, it does. It's just interesting because there's a bunch of texts that are just now being discovered. They were just discovered recently, that are like, I guess, attributed to like Gnostic texts and gospels of just esoteric gospels of like after the around couple like earlier than they were created earlier than this time period, but they were just found in the last like 100 or so years, and they say like the same things, so it's just like interesting. Thank you.
Pretty different. Someone asked, Maimonides was a follower of Greek thought. I'm looking at the chat. I mean, he was an Aristotelian thinker, for better and for worse. But of course, he was influenced by Jewish thought and Jewish culture. But the Guide to the Perplexed and really the Mishnah Torah make clear that he believed that Greek thought a la Aristotle, which he learned from Arab teachers probably, was the truth. Through that lens, you could find the truth. Basically, we might say through the scientific method, but that's probably not exactly right, but close enough for
Thank you.
1137.
Thank you so much. We need to move into our harvest and our closing for the night, but there's one important thing I need to take issue with you on, which is your contention that reading the Guide for the Perplexed is not fun. I think it's so much fun. And Ellen Solomon at Ner Shalom has been talking about starting a Guide for the Perplexed reading group. And if people are interested in that, I think it's so cool.
Well, I'll tell you what, if you guys end up doing that, let me know, because I'm not going to say I think it's fun, because I don't, but there's some parts to it that I think are really beautiful. And it would be fun to share some of that with you all down the road.
Yeah. I mean, I think you get how much, some of it is about correcting what he sees as everyone's errors in their beliefs. But a part of it is also like such deep, genuine seeking, creating just a new understanding that he thinks will stand the test of time, and it does.
Yeah, you're right.
I
hope you guys pick that up, and I'll come and play with you some.
That would be wonderful. George, thank you so much for being with us. Please.
Yeah.
Refuah shlema, quick healing to you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone. Sorry I had to
night.
present this way, but see ya.
So glad you were with us. Good night.
Yeah.
So I'm going to turn this over to Barbara to begin our just a little bit of harvest.
Yeah.
And then we have another chant to close with.
Well, I don't feel like I'm the one who could harvest Michael's talk, because my mind just went in so many directions that I feel like I need to listen again in order to pull all those threads together. But I think so much of what Michael offers us is absolutely out of the box, out of the universe thinking, so that we re-envision how we walk on this planet in so very many ways. And so I feel that set me up for just allowing my mind to be a sieve that let things in. And I moved from there into the talk by Ruach Devorah on the way in which we banished women goddesses and what they have spoken. And that feels like a thread that we have really enjoyed exploring with Ruach Devorah and with Shoshana, and one that continues to spark interest for us. And it's almost as if every time we touch it, we learn something different, some different figures. And the other piece of it is obviously the very rich iconography, the images, the constructions. So as you were talking about the body that's one side male and one side female, I remembered some of the images that Ruach Devorah showed us of the women with male genitalia. We didn't start this by thinking which themes are going to work well together. It was which teachers were going to inspire us. And it always thrills me when there are these points of connection that are unexpected. And I made the strange assumption that Basha and Reb Judith would be talking about Buddhism and Judaism. But really what they were talking about were sparks. And I had already started thinking of sparks during Michael's talk. the way in which the light comes through the broken vessels and how we receive that light. And what do we do to be open to it, to be vehicles that can receive Torah, that can receive those commandments coming down off the mountain. And it's just been such an evening for me, and I hope for others, of unexpected bliss. The learning has been so rich and so incredibly deep and varied, and the way in which your talk connected with others, and it felt like we were deepening our understanding, having started with your drashas about Joseph. It gave us a whole new framework. So I feel like I've talked too much. And it was probably 2 minutes, but it felt like a lot and a lot of words. And I'd be curious, Reb Irwin, you know, your kind of takeaways from tonight.
Well, I'm interested in the group's takeaways, and I'm
Yeah.
curious if people have specific insights, learnings that they're going to take with them, or questions that they're going to take with them, and maybe folks can start popping those into the chat, and and I'll say that while that's happening, I will say that. You know, while you were with Ruach Devorah, we were with Gesher, and we did a lot of, Leah and I did a lot of gasping and sighing and giggling and leaning in and leaning out. It was just a very beautiful teaching, and brought us inter alia into like the Hebrew letters as the Hebrew letters themselves as metaphors for the movement from non-duality to duality, and it was really kind of wonderful. And yeah, and we all experienced me together, and we all experienced this teaching from Rabbi George, and just very grateful for it.
And what about Elaine's teaching about
Oh gosh,
Esther Kreitman? And
that
I
was
was just,
so much
I
fun.
was bereft not to be able to be there.
It was you know, it's the kind of thing that's, you know, there's the sad piece of it, right? That she never achieved the fame, and that her brothers who did become famous did not actually promote her or support her in her writing. And there's a piece of that that's just very hard. You know, it's a story that you would expect, and it's hard to listen to, hard to hear. Um, and one of the things that arose out of it in the conversation is that, you know, there are so many. We know the Yiddish, the women Yiddish poets that we know, writers that we know, tend to be poets, and we read a lot of their poetry in Yiddish. But there were also a lot of novelists, and their books haven't been preserved, and they haven't been translated. And there's a project coming now that's finding these books, and sometimes we were told looking at microfilm of Yiddish newspapers where their novels were serialized, and reassembling them and translating them. And this is a project starting through the Yiddish Book Center. And so we're going to see a flowering in the near future of Yiddish novels Yiddish novels by women now in translation. So that's a very exciting piece that we were taking away. Let's see what ended up in the chat. Leah, we can catch the Shefa when we open to non-duality without trying to avoid non-duality. Does anyone else want to pop an insight, a question, a takeaway? It could be like, should next year I want to have more cheesecake? Rabbi Diane says, I've pondered very much what fueled the eclipse of the divine feminine and the concomitant repression of women's power in the human world. Ruach Devorah spoke of hatred. Might there have been fear underlying the hatred? And what cultural and economic factors influenced this movement? And was it inevitable?
Yeah.
Oh, may I say something? I didn't put it in the
Go,
chat.
go
Or
ahead, Rita.
yeah,
Be your own chat.
oh, I'm unchatting. In other words, you can hear me? Oh,
Funny that talking is a transgression of chatting.
oh, transgression rocks. Love it. Was it Alice in Wonderland that originally said feed your head? Well, my head was so well nourished and cleansed and ecstatic, except the opposite of ecstatic, which means standing outside yourself, especially by Michael Lerner's talk. That was like, I've been in graduate school a few times, but it was this real exercise for my intellect and the place where the intellect meets the spirit, kind of, if that's a place, rather than a lot of places. And in fact, my head was so full that it reminded me that my stomach was not full. So I had to take a bit of a break and eat a large, nutritious meal and meant to come back sooner, but I'm glad I came back for the final part. And learning is so delicious, and it's just, yeah, it has kept me alive. It has helped me survive to be so in love with learning. And what a treasure tonight has been. Just thank you so much, Dean Barbara, and everybody who put this together. And I'm a night owl, but you guys are staying up mighty late. Probably are normal sleepers. That's enough out of me.
Thank you, Rita. And
In the past, we used to be delighted to have 10 people left at midnight. And I think we've tripled that. I mean, the number of you who are still with us tonight, it makes my heart sing. And to know that what we've offered has been nourishing.
I want to remind folks of a couple of things. One is that tomorrow at 4 o'clock at Ner Shalom, we'll continue the learning. Barbara will be offering.
I am going to be looking at a pair of essays by lesbian feminist poets, one Jewish, one Afro-Caribbean, Audre Lorde and Adrienne Rich, and time permitting, abyssal of their poetry. In terms of the fact that when you stop talking about something, it starts becoming taboo to talk about it, and how that relates to our current reality. So just a kind of minor little goal for the 45 minutes.
And I'll be leading us in discussion of, I have 4 queer poems from Jewish history, 2 from medieval times, and 1 from the 19th century and 1 from the 20th century. And it will be fun and eye-opening just to be reading them, just to see that they exist and they're beautiful. I also want to remind people, and there will be cheesecake.
Thank you, Leah.
Thank you, Leah. And I want to remind people, when we finish in a few minutes, before you go and plop into bed, maybe step outside. You could look out your window, but stepping outside and looking at that sky and see if you can catch it at the moment that the sky opens up for revelation. And see what else you receive before you go to bed. So we're going to close with another beautiful chant from Leah.
This is Debbie Nargi-Brown's song. It's called Be Open. It's very easy to learn, so sing along as soon as you catch it. Be open for something wonderful to happen. Be open to the possibility. Be open for something wonderful to happen. Be open to the possibility. The next part goes, I-A, 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 I-A. Be open for something wonderful to
Be open.
to the possibility. Be open for something wonderful to happen. Be open to the possibility. I-A, 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 I-A. Be open for something wonderful to happen. Be open to the possibility. Be open for something wonderful to happen. Be open to the possibility.
Good night, everyone. Good Yantif, Chag Sameach, much continuing revelation, much continuing courage. And we will look forward to seeing some of you tomorrow at Ner Shalom at 4. And if not, we'll see you somewhere, sometime soon.
Good Yontif, Lila Tov.
Lila Tov.
Open.
That's Lila Tov.
Good Yantif. Thank you very
Good
much.
Yantif.
Good
And if somebody can
Chag
give a
Sameach.
ride tomorrow from Sebastopol, please contact Lilith.
Might make it.
Yantiv, Tadav.